Friends, this time I plan to talk about consular diplomacy and diaspora work. The two are connected. And you remember that in the four pillars of diplomacy, this was the fourth and final pillar. That is following political, economic, public diplomacy, and then consular and diaspora affairs. Consular diplomacy is governed by a special international instrument called the 1963 Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. It was negotiated immediately after the famous Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. It is an adjunct to that, and it shows that there was a time when consular work was regarded as rather important but separate from diplomatic work. This convention is longer, by the way, compared with VCDR, and it is perhaps a little less international in its support. For example, it has two supporting documents which are not accepted by everyone around the world, and for international law experts, the Convention on Consular Relations is a more contested document in some ways. Why is consular diplomacy today regarded as much more important than it used to be? In fact, there was a time, and this is my first point, there was a time when consular work was regarded as the Cinderella of diplomacy, the kind of sector of activity that people weren't terribly attracted by. It was also called sometimes the retail branch of diplomacy because it dealt with citizens, it dealt with people, it dealt with individual cases of people who suffered distress when they were abroad, had tragedies, were arrested for some reason or the other, and of course it dealt with the issue of passports and visas. These are basic documents that travelers need, although an increasing number of countries now have visa exemption agreements, but we'll come back to that point a little bit later. So, why has consular work gained in importance today? It's because many people travel abroad, many more than before. Many have migrated abroad, and there are lots and lots of foreign students, travelers, short-term visitors, people who go on adventure travel, etc., etc. And when they run into a problem, that becomes a consular problem. There is another reason why consular work has gained in importance, and that is because of large migration of people. Now, migration is not a new thing, but one dimension of globalization that went into drive, went into sharp momentum in the 90s, shall we say. One dimension was that a lot of people went abroad to live, to work, or sometimes to settle down. And of course, many went as refugees. They demanded political asylum. They were really very often seeking economic refuge, or shall we say advancement of their economic careers by shifting from countries of the global south in Asia, Latin America, Africa, to the rich countries which had a need for labor. Now, Mexico, for example, has a huge number of people in North America, particularly in the United States. It is estimated that the number of people that live in the US who are of Mexican origin is in the neighborhood of 30 million, of whom almost 10 million were undocumented. Mexicans hate the word illegal, and I think they are right. Nobody is illegal. These were simply people who did not have valid visas or travel documents that gave them the right of access to one country or another. It could be the US, it could be Germany, it could be UK, France, or whatever. A number of countries decided that they would give consular work a special importance because of this expansion in travel, expansion in consular work demand, to the point where every diplomat is required, say in Japan, to spend at least 1 year on working on consular affairs. When I was a very young diplomat, I handled 1 or 2 consular issues in China. The visit I paid to an Indian who had been arrested in Shanghai, and used to send a person from Beijing, 1500 kilometers away, every 3 or 4 months to meet him. It was a sad case of a businessman who was in an illegal marriage or an undocumented marriage. That again, undocumented is the word, with a Chinese lady. When India-China relations went haywire, he was arrested and put in jail because of the fact that he was living with a lady without formal marriage. Those visits I made to him in jail, and the tears with which he met me and received the few magazines that I was allowed to bring in the Chinese jail system, it brought home to me the importance of that human contact for that Indian citizen in distress in that country. My second big point is to talk about the way consular diplomacy is carried out. Consulates general and consulates are an adjunct of embassies. They are usually attached to embassies. They serve under the supervision of embassies. But occasionally you may have a country where there is a consulate general but no embassy, because the country has not decided to establish a resident embassy, but is happy to have a small consular mission. Now, in those situations, the consulates also do a little bit of diplomatic type of work, that is, political relationship building. But otherwise, the classic consulate general or consulate worked on consular affairs, not so much on the other branches of diplomacy. That has changed now. Today, every consulate general, every consulate works really as a sub-embassy. It is in effect an embassy, with the difference that it is not usually based in the capital of the country, but it is based in some other city, covering a region of that country, covering a part of that country. But in that part of the country, it engages in economic relationship building, public diplomacy, of course consular work, and also political work, with the difference that it connects with the state level or province level authorities of the region or the city where it's located. It does not connect with the capital of the country, with the foreign ministry. That's an important difference. Then there is another category of representation, which is called the Honorary Consul General or the Honorary Consul. Now, this is very interesting. This is one branch of diplomacy where people who are not full-time employees of a government and people who are often citizens of the other country work in an honorary capacity representing the interests of that country. So, the Indian Honorary Consul General in Stuttgart in Germany, for example, would usually be a German citizen, would usually be an outstanding person with wide connections, a businessman, a professor, a leading cultural or public personality. And that person would help the sending country, or shall we say the nominating country, because the right word is nomination. The nominating country would be assisted by this person. So it's a special mechanism. And every appointment of an honorary consul general or honorary consul requires the consent of the receiving country. That is, they have to be satisfied that this is a person of good standing, of reputation, who will help the two countries to come a little closer informally. He doesn't do a full-time job, he's not usually paid, and usually does not even issue visas, much less any other kind of consular documents, but acts as a facilitator, as a bridge builder. All this is covered in the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations that I mentioned a while back, and that is an important branch of activity. Some other new activities. You now have a situation where a consulate general representing country X will also look after citizens of countries Y and Z and A and C, for example, simply because those countries belong to a regional group and they cooperate closely. But this can only be done again with the permission of the receiving country. My final point is about diaspora diplomacy. Now, diaspora diplomacy is a big subject. It's a subject that has gained in prominence only in the last 20 years or so. The country that first started the whole notion of a home country connecting with people who used to be citizens of that country or have emotional connections with that country was Israel. Israel has viewed itself as the homeland of the Jewish diaspora. That phrase, Jewish diaspora, is biblical in origin. But today we all use that term. We all speak of our citizens who settled abroad, took citizenship in other countries, or who live and work in foreign countries. We call them all members of our diaspora. India has been a fast mover in the notion of connecting with diasporas. And what diaspora diplomacy is all about is really how to use the people who have a connection with the home country to act as bridge builders between the home country and the country where the diaspora reside. And it's actually a very neat way of countries to connect. It's mostly countries of the global south, African countries, Latin Americans, Asians, who now reach out to their diaspora, give them information about the home country, attract them to come and invest in the home country, to transfer technology, to bring their expertise. A medical doctor, say, living in Philadelphia or in Hamburg, may come to India for 2 weeks of lectures or give a demonstration of his surgical techniques, for example. All these are ways of using or working with the diaspora. So now there is a further development. There are some smart countries. The United States is one example, the UK, Australia, these are all good examples, Canada. They now use the diaspora, say, of Sri Lanka to connect with Sri Lanka, or the diaspora of Malaysia to connect with Malaysia. Because you remember, all along I've been saying that political diplomacy, bilateral diplomacy has now really become more and more a matter of shared parallel activities by two countries. Because of this cooperative, this collegial nature of diplomacy today, the diaspora of India in Canada becomes a connector for the Canadian government to work with India. These are new ways of functioning. As far as Western countries go, you have Switzerland. It has an organization that is called Présence Suisse, the Swiss presence, which links the Swiss, wherever they inhabit, with the home country. The Irish have always connected with their diaspora because the island has probably more citizens, more people of Irish origin living abroad than within the country itself. And that happens in many countries. Armenia, a little country, that's an example of a country with a population of 1.5 or 2 million, and the Armenian diaspora abroad is 10 million strong. So, diaspora diplomacy is now increasingly important. It is a connector between countries, and it's a way in which diplomatic actions have been enriched and enlarged. I will conclude by referring to the impact of the COVID pandemic. It is very hard to predict what will happen to the travel industry in the future, what is likely to be the shape of students going to foreign countries to study, or for that matter, the nature of migration. Already we see indications that migration flows will probably slow down. They have already slowed down right now, but it will probably have an effect for a while. What impact will that have on consular diplomacy, on diaspora diplomacy? These are difficult issues. I talked about consular affairs and diaspora affairs. I omitted to mention one set of special problem issues that come up. When people marry across nationalities and sometimes marriages break down, we have the problem of custody of children. And that becomes a very complicated legal issue because it involves the jurisdiction of two countries with two different legal systems. And more than anything else, it involves human tragedy, human challenges. Governments, courts all over work very hard to reconcile these kind of complex issues. I wanted to give you a flavor of the nature of consular diplomacy and diaspora diplomacy. I hope I provided some useful information. I hope you enjoy these little chats of mine and maybe think of subscribing to the series as well. I will continue with several more talks covering other branches of diplomatic work. Thank you very much.